All right, this is the second session of our presentation on the imperialism, American imperialism unit. The big focus, of course, will be the foreign policy of Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. And so before we get to Roosevelt, we want to finish up the McKinley presidency. We left off in the first video, the first YouTube, on the Spanish-American War, the end of the Spanish-American War. And we want to finish up the rest of McKinley. McKinley will be assassinated in 1901. So we want to be able to cover the important events from 1899 to 1901. So first of all, we're going to lead off with imperialism in China, where we're going to have what's called the open door policy. So essentially, foreign powers have been interested in China in its lucrative market and the opportunity to convert the Chinese to Christianity. And so the United States, being part of this, sees the opportunity of annexing the Philippines. You can see on this map here, you can see how the Philippines now kind of acts as a springboard onto China and access to those very lucrative Chinese markets. So in 1899, Secretary of State John Hay drafted what was called the Open Door Note. And so he was worried that due to the United States' distance from China, the United States might lose access to China if it didn't act quickly enough. And so essentially what the Open Door Note does is it essentially attempts to accomplish two things. Number one, and this is the important one, is he proposes this is an important word, partitioning China into what are called spheres of influence. Spheres of influence. So you can see the nations that are involved here. We've got the British sphere, the French, the Japanese, the Russian, the German sphere. Everyone has their interests there in China. And so essentially what the sphere of influence looks like is that each nation would be given access to certain ports from which they can conduct commerce. And this, by dividing China, by partitioning China into spheres of influence, it would perhaps prevent an outbreak of war over China. So the second thing, the second goal of the Open Door Note is to essentially guarantee and respect Chinese rights and the ideal of fair economic competition in China. So to respect the rights, the territorial integrity of China, they're going to partition China, they're going to create the spheres of influence in China, but they are not going to seize territory from China. So, and of course, America becomes, and as a result, an equal opportunity exploiter. All right, so there you go. There you go. That's what it looks like right there. All right, political cartoon showing the Western powers carving up China amongst themselves. And so, you know, to the chagrin of the Chinese. Now, China, as we know from our AP World History experience, China has got a long, rich history of being very hostile to the outside world. They're a very closed society, and they didn't react well to the open door policy. An example of this will be in 1900. Of course, in 1900, millions of Chinese people were enraged at being subjugated by imperial powers. The Boxers, as you see here, an extreme group of Chinese nationalists, killed over 200 missionaries and other whites, while a number of foreign diplomats were being besieged in Beijing. In order to suppress the Boxer Rebellion, the Western powers sent a multinational force of about 18,000 troops, including 2,500 American troops, to suppress the Boxer Rebellion, and successfully. And the victorious allies then imposed upon China a $333 million indemnity for the Chinese government to pay for the trouble of having to suppress the rebellion. So there you go. You see the missionary outreach. The missionaries, the attempt to spread Christianity is probably more the focal point of the Boxer Rebellion. That's the part that Chinese nationalists found most offensive. Now, of course, 1900 also is an election year, and you can see that, you know, this political poster, that what was America going through, what was the state of the United States prior to McKinley's presidency. You know, an economic downturn, economic troubles. We had a foreign policy crisis right off the coast of the United States. And within his first term, he brought stability domestically and, of course, around the world. So he's running. He's definitely a heavyweight, very popular. And the big shift, of course, you have the hero of the Battle of San Juan Hill, the Rough Rider, the progressive governor from New York, 42-year-old Teddy Roosevelt is put on the ticket as vice president. So what American foreign policy is part of this broader, you know, what this broader global imperialism is, this concept that what drove it was this idea of advancing civilization to peoples around the world that weren't advanced. They weren't civilized. And so here you can see this represented in the political cartoon, where the British and the Americans are trying to lead what they see as quote unquote backwards people towards civilization. And they can see it's an uphill climb. It's very, very difficult. And so Rudyard Kipling, the poet, writes a poem with this theme called The White Man's Burden, in which he says, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, you new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." Also, prior to McKinley's death, war is going to break out in the Philippines. The United States promised the Philippines independence prior to as the Spanish-American War was breaking out. The Filipinos under Emilio Aguinaldo will resist the Spanish, and under the auspices that the United States would help secure an independence for the Filipinos. Unfortunately, this did not happen. The United States Senate narrowly passed Philippine annexation, and open rebellion begins in 1899 when insurrection breaks out, fighting breaks out, savage fighting breaks out in the Philippines against the American troops. Filipino rebels fled to the jungle, where they waged an effective guerrilla warfare. And of course, American troops responded with atrocities, and including burning the fields, creating crop shortages in a way to break the back of the insurgents. And all 4,300 Americans were killed, but 57,000 Filipinos are going to die. The anti-imperialists really intensified their protests. They claimed that the United States fight to free Cuba morphed into a war 10,000 miles away to deprive the Filipinos of their freedom. And so the Anti-Imperialist League is really going to come out against against American action in the Philippines. Eventually, like I said, the insurrection will be suppressed, but it was very divisive. As you can see, here's a political cartoon criticizing American policy in the Philippines, showing a squad of American troops doing the old firing squad on a bunch of Filipino children. So Americans are killing children, and this is pro-American policy, kind of showing what the United States has done for these oppressed people. This is kind of a before picture. Here's a after picture. Well, what about the constitutionality of all of this? Well, the Supreme Court rules in 1901 through 1905 in a series of decisions that, in effect, inhabitants of overseas territories do not have full constitutional rights. So people who live in American-held territories like Guam, Hawaii, Philippines, Puerto Rico, do not have full-blown constitutional rights. So the Constitution doesn't follow the flag. Okay, I want to introduce the Anti-Imperialist League. The Anti-Imperialist League is the most significant, most influential organization combating this aggressive foreign policy, and it was formed in order to oppose the expansionism of President McKinley. It included the presidents of Stanford and Harvard, as well as labor leader Samuel Gompers, industrialist Andrew Carnegie, political professor William Graham Sumner, and of course, Mark Twain. Mark Twain, I'm going to bypass this. This is Mark Twain's idea for their new flag. And only the way that Mark Twain can do it. We know through our debate that the annexation of the Philippines was very divisive. Really splintered Americans as to the morality of it. And, you know, I think one of the great arguments against it is that now America has become the King George III. The United States, it's not in our credo to have colonies because of our experience during our own revolution. So we are now the oppressors. We are now King George III. So a pivotal moment in the history, really, what really changes the story here is going to be the assassination of William McKinley by an anarchist in 1901 while he's visiting the World's Fair in Buffalo, New York. It elevates into the White House vice president, 42-year-old firebrand Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, of course, is the first American president to play a significant role in world affairs. He's going to implement his big stick foreign policy and imperialism in the Western Hemisphere. And he's going to be a major proponent of military expansion and naval preparedness. And so, yeah, so we're going to really analyze the foreign policy by these three presidents. You know, we have Roosevelt and his big stick diplomacy, William Howard Taft, dollar diplomacy, and Woodrow Wilson, moral diplomacy. So Roosevelt used the big stick policy, which is the use of military, economic power in order to protect American interests in our hemisphere. And so he said, speak softly, carry a big stick, and you will go far. We're going to see what that looked like. So his big stick diplomacy basically had two objectives. Number one, let's keep Europe out of Latin America. And this, of course, this is Roosevelt Corollary. The Roosevelt Corollary is essentially a reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine, this idea, his belief that the United States has the right to intervene in Latin American affairs when it comes to promoting stability and peace and prosperity in the hemisphere. And it also advocates the use of force to defend American interests in Latin America. So what really spawned the Roosevelt Corollary was in 1802, Germany brought naval forces into the Caribbean to force Venezuela to pay a debt that it owed to Germany. Okay, the British do the same thing in the same year, and you can see it in this political cartoon, where the British moved in naval forces into near the Dominican Republic, and Roosevelt reacted by issuing the Roosevelt Corollary, in which he says European nations should stay out of the Americas altogether. And if Europe has a problem with Latin America, the United States will settle the issue on their behalf. So no European interference in the affairs of Latin America. And so here you can see in this political cartoon the big stick in the Caribbean Sea, where he's got the sea circled with the ring of naval power, military power, where, you know, we use that metaphor of Big Brother, that the United States is the big brother for Latin America and will take leadership in promoting peace, prosperity in the entire hemisphere. He goes on to say in his 1904 State of the Union, all that this country desires is to see the neighboring countries stable, orderly, and prosperous. Any country whose people conduct themselves well can count upon our hearty friendship. If a nation shows that it knows how to act with reasonable efficiency and decency in social and political matters, if it keeps order and pays its obligations, it need fear no interference from the United States. Chronic wrongdoing, an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society, may ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation. And in the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to exercise of an international police power. So the United States as an international police power, especially in the hemisphere, in the Western Hemisphere. And so the United States becomes that policeman of the hemisphere. We police the hemisphere. And that's what the Roosevelt Corollary promotes. He also is the disciple. Roosevelt's a disciple of Alfred Thayer Mahan. So you want to go back and review Mahan and look at what his blueprint for what American policy should look like. And at the core, Mahan believed that in order for the United States to become a great power, it must be a naval power. Roosevelt sees this through. By 1907, the United States under Roosevelt will construct what's called the Great White Fleet, then sends the Great White Fleet on a worldwide sightseeing tour, which really was an opportunity for the United States to proverbially flex its muscle to the rest of the world, to kind of flaunt American power. And you can see, and why do we do it? Because we can, right? Because we're the United States, we're powerful, we're the leading economy in the world. And so he sails this fleet around the world, shows it off as a demonstration of American power. There's the path. And he does spend a lot of time in the Asian realm, in the Asian theater over here, especially around China. One thing that you're going to need to know in this unit is that the United States and Japan, our relations with each other will deteriorate significantly. The Japanese are very angry. They're going to grow very angry at the United States. I think one is they see us as a rising naval power, where we become we have a bit of a naval arms race with them. We also, because of our intervention in China, Japan doesn't really like Europe or America in China, and they definitely don't like us annexing the Philippines. They see that as marching on their turf. So the path to the bombing of Pearl Harbor really is initiated with the Roosevelt presidency. And this is getting old too. Sailing all the way around the Straits, going through the Straits of Magellan to get to the Philippines, to get to China. So this is really going to push for a Panama Canal. And so what happens in the Panama Canal, the British and the French tried to build the canal before us, and they failed. The big problem with the canal zone in Panama is that it's swampy, it's a lot of mosquitoes, and it kills a lot of people. Yellow fever, malaria. And so they eventually pull out and they don't build it. But the British give the United States permission to build the canal. It's theirs. They own the canal zone. So the United States gains access to the canal zone from the British. But Colombia, which Panama at the time belongs to Colombia, the Colombian government voted no. They told the United States that they cannot build a canal. And so at this time, while all this stuff is going on, a rebellion has broken out in Panama. You see, the Panamanians here, they want their independence from Colombia. So Roosevelt supports the rebels. He sends the military, he sends the Navy off the coast of Colombia, and he then pledges his support to aid the Panamanian rebels. And at this time, the Colombian government gave the Panamanians their independence, and then the Panamanians gave us access to the canal zone. And the United States recognized the country of Panama in November of 1903. And This really made Roosevelt look to the outside world as a bit of a dictator, bit of a heavy-handed president who kind of bullied his way in getting the canal zone. So, and Latin American countries began to resent the United States, began to call the United States the quote-unquote Colossus of the North. Okay, the Colossus of the North. So they began construction of the canal in 1911. They finished it in 1914. One of the first things that Americans do in the canal zone is they drain the swamps, fumigate the jungles, and eliminate the mosquitoes. And so they eventually, the Panama Canal Zone will have a cleaner health record than New York City. New York City. So it was a great success of American ingenuity, technology, and engineering. And now we can have a two-ocean Navy. Now, you know, this really benefits the United States and its international interests, economic interests, especially to a great degree. Another issue is going to be related to this political cartoon. It is the 1904 Russo-Japanese War. Russia and Japan went to war over control of ports in Manchuria, which is a region in China, and Korea. Japan was successful in destroying much of the Russians' fleet, which basically shocked the world because they didn't think Japan was that strong. Japan went to the United States and asked if Roosevelt would help negotiate a peace negotiation. And of course, Roosevelt was excited because he wanted to prevent either side, either the Russians or the Japanese, from really gaining a monopoly in Asia. So he invited them to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the Japanese and the Russians negotiated an end to the Russo-Japanese War with Roosevelt as the arbitrator. The first time in American history that a U.S. president has ended a global conflict, has negotiated the end of a global conflict. And for this, Roosevelt wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. Now, the big thing I want you to understand with the Russo-Japanese War is two things. One, Roosevelt is interested also because he's fearful that the Russo-Japanese War may expand and thereby threatening the open door to China. And number two, both Japan and Russia believe that Roosevelt had secretly manipulated that treaty to screw them both. In fact, both sides really feel like they got the raw end of that treaty. And so, again, this furthers U.S.-Japanese tension. In addition to another event, it's not on the PowerPoint, but I'm going to describe it. In 1906, the San Francisco School Board voted to prevent Asians from attending public schools. So what you're looking at is that's 70,000 Japanese immigrants that had come to California and come into San Francisco and would be denied public education in San Francisco. Now, the Japanese, you know, there are people that are very sensitive about race. They're very sensitive about race, and they took this as a huge slight, to the extent that the Japanese press even began to talk about war. And, you know, Roosevelt was concerned that California might actually be provoking a major war with Japan. So in order to prevent war and to kind of chill things down a bit, Roosevelt invited the entire San Francisco School Board to the White House and convinced them to allow the Asian kids to go to school. And really, in exchange for this, the Japanese will sign with the United States. This is a no-card term. It's called the Gentleman's Agreement, in which the Japanese agreed to stop immigration to the United States, and California agreed not to ban Japanese kids from American public schools. So here we go. So next president is William Howard Taft. And here you can see, and we'll learn all about the relationship between Roosevelt and Taft and the Progressive Era unit. But just to say that Taft is not a big believer in the big stick. He doesn't believe in the use of military force, aggressive action vigorously promote American interest in Latin America. So you can see as Roosevelt's leaving the White House, so goes the big stick. He promoted dollar diplomacy. And so what dollar diplomacy is essentially the primary objective is, it's a diplomacy that protects American business interests in Latin America. So it's essentially using American, Wall Street dollars and using economic power in order to promote American business interests and American economic interest in Latin America. So that is Mr. Taft. And that's really all we need to know about Taft. So then we've got Mr. Wilson. That's Mr. Moral Diplomacy. Now, Wilson campaigned for the presidency in 1912, basically promising to end imperialism. In fact, he publicly said that he hated imperialism. He hated an aggressive foreign policy. He opposed big stick diplomacy. He opposed dollar diplomacy. But the irony is that Wilson turned out to be the most interventionist president in Latin America than any president in American history. All right. So he turned out to be a huge hypocrite. And after all, this is the president that gets the United States involved in World War I, which I would say is one of the most interventionist acts that the United States will have committed in its early history. So let's look at kind of the deal here. So the objective of moral diplomacy, and really what it's all about, is supporting democratic governments in Latin America. It's about spread. He's interested in spreading democracy in our hemisphere, and not only supporting democratic governments, but also opposing oppressive ones, opposing undemocratic governments. And so for the AP exam and for my class, the one example I want you to know well, where Wilson applies moral diplomacy, is in the nation of Mexico, okay? In Mexico. So ultimately, I would like so make sure, let's go through the issue of Mexico, which ultimately resulted in Woodrow Wilson ordering naval and marine forces into Mexico to depose an elected leader in Mexico, to remove him from power by military force. And the big sin was that the president that had been elected by Mexico was not pro-American. He was not. He acted in contrary to American economic interests in Mexico. So ultimately, for example, one thing that I believe his name was General Huerta, what General Huerta had done, that when he became president, he nationalized the country. In fact, all the property that Americans had owned in Mexico is going to be essentially stripped from these American investors. When you nationalize something, that means you're reclaiming it, as you're reclaiming it. So it's essentially at one point, Americans owned almost half of all property in Mexico. I mean, imagine that. Americans owned nearly half of all property in Mexico. And foreigners from other countries owned nearly 25% of all property in Mexico. And so what Huerta does is he just simply restores the property that belongs to Mexico. And of course, business interests in the United States, they lose their freaking mind, and they ask Wilson to do something. Well, Wilson sends in the military. He deposes Huerta. He sees Huerta as a brute, and he says, quote, "I am going to teach the South American republics to elect good men." And he succeeded. He succeeded through military force. He succeeded in overthrowing Huerta and installing a new leader of Mexico that was pro-American. And this caused violence to break out along the American-Mexican border from an individual by the name of Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa, he will cross into American territory in Texas and Arizona, raiding American towns. Wilson will have no choice but to order military forces to the border, penetrating as far as 300 miles into Mexico and going after Pancho Villa. So, Pancho Villa altogether killed dozens of Americans, but ultimately Pancho Villa was, though we never caught Pancho Villa, he was eventually assassinated in 1923, and the United States will withdraw from Mexico in 1917, and yeah, it was a big black guy without a doubt. So Wilson's foreign policy Wilson foreign policy was so unpopular that it was so openly repudiated that, well, in 1920, the Democrats and the progressives will lose power, in large part due to Wilson's overreach in foreign policy. So that's it. Have a great evening, and we will see you down the road.